Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about writing for specialist journals versus generalist journals. These are academic journals, by the way. I talked about some of the differences between them in a previous video. There is going to be some overlap between this video and that video, but the focus here is going to be more on a couple of specific techniques that you can use to tailor your writing one way or the other. So one of the key things that I talked about in that previous video is that specialist journals are more jargon-y, and they require a certain degree of knowledge from readers that generalist journals don't. Generalist journals are less likely to assume that readers already know specific things within the field, and they're less likely to assume that terminology will be familiar. Again, this is not something that I recall ever having learned about in grad school, but it's a useful thing to be aware of, because when you start sending scholarly pieces out, or if you're already sending scholarly pieces out, one thing that can play an important role in determining whether or not your article gets accepted is whether or not it is tailored for the type of journal you're writing for. And actually, the first time that I sort of had this revelation and sort of came to understand how important this is, I had sent a piece to the journal Limina, which is a generalist journal, and one of the concrete suggestions that they gave me for revision was to briefly introduce authors better. So, in grad school, for the most part, when I had introduced an author, I would just use that author's name. Wendy Brown says, Slavoj Žižek says, Todd McGowan says, whatever it is. What they suggested is that for a generalist audience, an audience of non-specialists who probably don't know who the people in a particular field are, giving us a brief introduction with the attribution is really beneficial for them. So, instead of, for example, Lokagenge Lasombe says, contemporary post-colonial theorist Lokagenge Lasombe says. This signals to people who these thinkers are. Contemporary philosopher Todd McGowan says. This again signals to readers who these people are. Whether or not journals want this is actually really idiosyncratic. Some journals prefer that this kind of signaling be done. Some editors or some journals will take this out of your articles. But this is one of the strategies that I have picked up in terms of shaping my writing, especially for a generalist journal, a generalist audience. If I know that this is a journal that's going to draw readers from a wide range of disciplines and not just English or theater studies, then I'm going to signal who these people are. I'm going to introduce those thinkers much more clearly than I might for a specialist journal. Because again, if I'm writing for a specialist journal, if I'm writing for a journal like Modern Drama or comparative drama or something like this, I will assume, or I can assume fairly safely, that that my readers are going to know who somebody like Antonin Artaud is. This is just a big name, a big player in the world of theater studies. If I'm writing for a generalist audience, I can't make that assumption, and so I need to give some background on Antonin Artaud in order to establish for the readers and bring them into this discipline that I'm working with. Similarly, so that's one of my big pieces of advice, when you are writing for generalist journals, especially, introduce the people that you are referring to. Tell readers who they are, because readers can't necessarily be expected to know. Whereas with specialist journals, there will be some there will be some people that you can introduce who you just won't need to tell us about. This is a piece of disciplinary knowledge that, as you move forward in your career, as you gain more knowledge, more background, etc., you get a better sense of. But it's something that's worth starting to learn as soon as you possibly can. So that's one piece of advice, one concrete strategy. Determine whether or not it is beneficial for you with this journal you're writing for to clearly introduce the people you're writing about. The second major piece of advice that I would give in terms of writing for generalist versus specialist journals is determine what kind of information needs to be elaborated upon. And this is kind of a related strategy, but here we're talking about concepts rather than individuals, thinkers, scholars, artists, whatever it is. So again, if we take the Antonin Artaud example, Artaud's big idea was the theater of cruelty. This is his concept. Theater studies people can be expected to have at least a basic knowledge of this. If I say in the pages of JDTC, Journal of Dramatic Theory and Criticism, theater of cruelty, I can reasonably expect that most people will have a sense of that. However, if I say in the pages of, say, the South Atlantic Review, which is a slightly specialized journal, they're a humanities journal with really an English and modern languages focus. If I say in the pages of South Atlantic Review, theater of cruelty, I'm going to have a lot of readers in that journal who are poetry people, who are fiction people, who are not theater studies people, and they may not know what that means. And so what I need to do then is elaborate on that. What does this mean? What does this term mean? And this concept, I think, is really an important one. Again, part of it is figuring out how to navigate common knowledge within your discipline, but part of it is also figuring out what you can expect of readers. And that's not always an easy thing to do. For example, I am in the process of, I actually have an article forthcoming about Evan Placey's play Jekyll and Hyde, which is a stage adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's novella, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, obviously. And one of the things that I had done in the original draft, because I'm doing a psychoanalytic reading for part of it, I had explained what the terms id, ego, and superego mean. For a generalist audience, I don't think that's a bad plan necessarily. But one of the pieces of feedback that the reviewer gave me was, most readers are probably going to know this. Most readers are probably going to have at least a sense of what these terms mean, so you don't need to devote the page space to them. Now, whether or not I necessarily agree that readers can reasonably be expected to know that doesn't matter that much, ultimately. I did decide to make the change and take out a lot of that explanation. And I do think it's a better essay for it, if I'm honest. But, again, this is one of those things where, like, there is a feeling out process. And so I don't think it's something to sort of worry about unduly, but it is something to start figuring out. And part of the problem with common knowledge is that not everyone may necessarily agree on what constitutes common knowledge within a particular discipline. So this is a challenge. But again, this is one of those things. Again, a specialist journal, you're going to be able to rely a lot more on common knowledge and not have to elaborate on what might seem like fundamental concepts quite as much. With a generalist journal where your audience may or may not have a background in the particular philosophy or practice that you're talking about, it's going to be much more beneficial to elaborate on things whenever possible. So those for me are the two real big elements in terms of tailoring your writing either for a specialist journal or a generalist journal. And it is worth noting the other thing here is I'm talking very much about like humanities style writing. I put this caveat in the other video about the distinctions between generalist and specialist journals. I'm talking very much about humanities, arts, style writing. Things like the social sciences, the hard sciences, where you're writing in sort of APA format with a very structured essay. You've got a whole different ballgame there. What I'm talking about is the type of essays that we tend to produce in the humanities, which are less concretely regimented. So APA format, very much regimented. MLA format, not as regimented in how you move through information. That's going to be another big difference. If you are writing for a journal that requires sort of APA structure, throw out much of what I've said in this essay. You've got a different approach you're taking there.